Welcome to the Millennial Rant, a podcast about whatever's bothering me today. With topics ranging from politics to pop culture, there's a rant to cover everyone. For more Millennial Rant content, you can join me on the web at millennialrant.com. A few weeks ago, I was at a Moms for America event in somewhere, Texas, and our Moms for America state liaison for Texas was there. And she asked me about stories and how we construct our lives through stories, largely because I had obviously mentioned that that's not usually something that people pick up on necessarily, that our lives are constructed as by and through stories. So she has a grandson and he is turning 14, or he already is 14, somewhere around that. So he's in that transitional phase, moving out of, little kids stories and into more adult stories. And she said that every Saturday or Sunday they have a family movie night, and the movies that they watch have to be family friendly because they have young kids. But this grandson he's bored because a lot of these movies are Christian movies created by the Christian film industry. And if you've ever seen them, whether you're Christian or not, some of them can be a little cringy. And it's not necessarily because they're bad stories. It's usually just because they're not especially well told all the time. And they can be very preachy. They can be very on the nose with their messaging. And people naturally recoil from those sorts of things. We as human beings like a little bit of ambiguity, a little bit of room for personal interpretation. And if the message is just right there, it really actually feels kind of uncomfortable. So that's what this boy expressed to his grandma. He said, "Grandma, can we not watch these movies because they're kind of cringy?" And so she's going through a conundrum because she's like, well, I want to have good movies that the family can participate in, but I also want him to be engaged. And one of the worst things that you can do when you have a teenager who comes to you and says, I don't really like the way this is going, can we change things, is just say a flat no, that you're not even willing to try and negotiate. So I told her the best thing that she could do would be to get him involved in selecting the stories, the movies that they're going to be watching for their family movie nights. That doesn't mean that he gets to pick whatever movie that he wants and they just have carte blanche, but there are a lot of really great movies out there that have really great stories, really great morals, really great messages that are not produced by the Christian film industry, or if they are, that aren't that over the top kind of holier than thou pious messaging. There is a time and a place for those things, absolutely, for sure. And I'm not knocking, the time and the talents that goes into making those films. But there's a certain level of preaching to the choir that comes with those sorts of films and stories and books and whatever, that may be the case. So she asked me, after we talked about this, and I gave her some different ideas, one of them being allow him the autonomy to help choose the films that the family is going to watch. She asked me, what is it that we want from stories? How can I transition as a story consumer with my grandson so that I don't lose him to the stories that the world is telling? Which is a very apt question. And I'm here to answer it as best I can. There is no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to stories. Lots of people like lots of different things. Some people like science fiction, some people don't. Some people like fantasy, some people don't. Some people like literary, other people... I shouldn't knock literary. I do have literary books that I enjoy. It's just for the most part, the entire genre is very... You know what I was saying about stories that are pious and on the nose and preachy? Yeah, most of them are like that. Except usually with sex. Anyway, so I can't give you a blanket answer when it comes to consuming stories as they currently stand in our society. There are stories that I personally would recommend because I enjoy them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you or somebody that you would hand them to would enjoy them. But I will talk about story in general and what story does to us as storytelling creatures. Because we are, of all of the animals on this earth, the storytelling animal. There's actually a book, I believe, that's called The Storytelling Animal. It's very interesting. And basically what that means is that what sets us apart from other animals is our ability to construct narratives. Not only to construct them, but to share them. And there are a bunch of different literary theories about what makes a good story, you know, what elements you have to have in order to be able to tell a story properly. How do you go from A to Z? You know, there's all sorts of people who will give you writing advice, who will give you storytelling advice, movie building and construction and all that sort of, that everybody has advice to give. The problem is that they're all telling you their way of doing things, which is fine for them. But there is no, again, one size fits all when it comes to stories. The best that you can do to figure out scientifically how stories affect people is to strip them down to their very, very bare bones. And we call these archetypes. They're originally a psychology theory that was developed by Carl Jung in, early 1900s. And he got into a tiff with Sigmund Freud and they had a breaking off. But the idea of the collective unconscious, these archetypes that all humankind shares, really took off. It's since been largely debunked from a psychological perspective, but the literary community still holds on to it very tightly because it resonates. And one of the reasons why it resonates is because there are certain fundamentals that come with stories, and they're fundamentals that we all recognize. Everybody knows the base archetypes, right? We have the savior, we have the lover, we have the hero, the villain, you know, the best friend, the shadow, the fool, the joker, all of these different archetypes, and how they stack up in stories varies by story. And there are different levels to these archetypes, and you, at their very, very base, their boiled down essence, they're the archetypes, and then you go one step up and they're called stock characters. And that's what Shakespeare pulled from. He had a whole basket of the same characters that he would pull out and he would recycle over and over again. The reluctant hero, the coming of age hero, the dark hero. He had the anti-hero in some of them. Then of course he had the strong female character and the damsel female character. He had the fool, the wise fool, the fool's fool, all of these different types of characters. And he would build his plays using these characters. So one of the things that made Shakespeare such a prolific, but also I think universally enjoyed, because he was enjoyed by the highest of the high to the lowest of the low, and his stories were very much an everyman type story where anybody could enjoy it. Not everybody did, but anybody could, you know, like the whole Ratatouille thing. One of the reasons why I think that this was the case is because he had these stock characters. They were characters that everyone in his society would know, would recognize, and would instantly be able to connect with. And then he also used plots that were known to some capacity. There are very few stories that Shakespeare just made up out of nowhere. Honestly, The Tempest. I'm not a Shakespearean scholar by any stretch of the imagination, so I don't know a great deal about his works, and which ones come from which mythologies or histories or whatever. He did a lot of history stories. He did a lot of mythological retellings or fable retellings. Hamlet was a retelling of a story from Denmark. And then there was, what's the other one that I'm thinking of? Midsummer Night's Dream pulls some from the Metamorphosis, I think it is. And then he has stories from Ovid, and anyway, he pulled from a lot of different areas. He wasn't just making things up off the top of his head. But those aren't the only kinds of stories that are foundational. It's not just myths, it's not just histories. There's also fairy tales. But fairy tales aren't necessarily what we think of when we think of fairy tales. And I know that's really confusing to say. So when we think of fairy tales, we think of like the Grimm's tales, right? Hans Christian Andersen tales, stories that were written down and passed down through the ages that way. But before the Grimm's brothers collected their tales into a book, they were oral stories. And one of the reasons why they have so many different versions of these oral stories is because they were passed around through oral tellings and retellings, and they were all told a little bit differently each time depending on the audience. Fairy tales are full of archetypes. It's one of the reasons why they resonate so deeply with so many people, is this idea that they're foundational. They're foundational and they're real and they're true in ways that just straight up telling the truth may not always be. There are plenty of truths that can be disbelieved, but when you tell a fairy tale, people connect with the truths that are in that story. Those are the stories we live by. As a culture, as a society, as individuals, the stories that we feed on, the archetypes that we absorb, especially when we're young, are what are going to shape us into the adults and the citizens and the hopefully well-rounded individuals that we will become. There's been a lot of pushback, especially in the last 5-6 years, on traditionally told fairy tales, and they've been twisted into dark fairy tales. They have been retold with different ideologies involved, like villains are shifted into either anti-heroes or heroes all along, or the story that we know is not the story as it was, and it's all these sorts of things. And those aren't bad in and of themselves. The problem is that people are looking at the stories that they're retelling as if they're fixing the original fairy tale. And they're not, because they don't understand the original fairy tale. Because the fairy tales as they were mean something completely different from the fairy tales as they are. Because the fairy tales as they were told at a time when all of the cultural ideologies that are contained in these fairy tales would have been widely known and understood. There is a very common idea in fairy tales that nobility and royalty are things that you aspire to because the nobility are noble. The royalty is honorable, they're true, they're just, they're virtuous. And that's because, one, the nobles and the royalty wanted the peasants to think that way. And two, because that was the ideal. That was what the peasants wanted to believe of these people who ruled over them. It was a cultural thing. Stories like, Rumpelstiltskin, when the girl is spinning and it says that she could spin straw into gold, that's actually a perversion, I guess, of the original tales that were spinning into gold, where spinning straw into gold was not a desirable trait in the original tales of this type. And the reason why it wasn't desirable was because a woman who could spin flax into thread was worth her weight in gold. And what good does it do to spin gold thread? You can't do anything with it. Gold belonged to the king. Gold was you didn't just trade in gold. And if you did, you were going to draw attention to yourself that you did not want. So in these stories, the girl is either she can't spin or she's spinning straw into gold, something that can't be eaten, something that can't be used, something that it just is useless. It's lavish and it's expensive, but it's useless. And that was, I think, largely a metaphor for girls who were pretty, but skillless. And so, if you didn't have a skill, it didn't matter how beautiful you were, type of thing. Now, once stories started to get written down, a lot of that went away, and it became this idea of beauty is the epitome no matter what it is that you're doing. What we need now then are not the same fairy tales that we've been telling. They're new fairy tales. We need new stories, new ideas that use old archetypes, old stock characters even, old plot lines, but new stories that are just as powerful as the original fairy tales were, but that are told for a modern audience, conveying those foundational truths of goodness and virtue and light and kindness, real beauty, real ingenuity, real cleverness, all of these different ideas that fairy tales were originally told to convey, but which have been lost in translation as our world has shifted dramatically and, irrevocably over the last century and a half. But people aren't telling those stories anymore, mostly because people don't have the same moral values anymore. You'll notice, I think, that a lot of the most popular stories now, be they movies or books, are ones that have a true underlying message, right? That, like in Star Wars, if you put your faith in a higher power than just yourself, you're going to be able to do things that you never expected you would be capable of doing. Now, sometimes people ascribe this higher power to God. Sometimes they ascribe it to the universe. Sometimes they ascribe it to aliens, random chance. But if you believe in a higher power, you're giving yourself something that you can aspire to, something that you can live up to. If all you believe in are things that are base and on level, then you can't progress. You can't grow because you stagnate. This is all there is, and there is nothing greater. There's nothing beyond. There's nothing to reach for. There's nothing to strive for. So that's one story that has put back into culture this idea of rising to something true and great and beautiful. There are other stories that do this really well. Despite what a lot of Christians may believe, Harry Potter actually does this really well. The idea underlying Harry Potter is that true love really is the greatest power in all of the world. True love between parents and children, true love between friends, true love between lovers and spouses and whatever. That love is the greatest power that exists. And those who do not understand love or feel love or share love ultimately are powerless. Other stories that are widely popular, Pokemon. There's, this aspiration, this idea that if you set goals, you can achieve those goals as long as you're willing to work hard for it. So a lot of the stories that are really popular now are true in a fundamental, almost spiritual sense. We need more of that. More stories that are true and real and moral and righteous. Those are the stories that you want to share, because those are the stories we live by. Those are the stories that tell us what is and isn't to be valued in society. Those are the stories that tell us what is and isn't to be considered acceptable in society. But the values have shifted. If you want to know what a culture believes, look at their art. And the art that we have been producing as a culture for the last 20, 30 years is largely garbage. From visual art to literature to movies and television, it's all just garbage. Because a new morality is being implemented, and it's being pushed in almost the exact same way as these over preachy, over everything Christian stories. It's just as cringy. It's just as uncomfortable. It's just as boring and uninteresting. And so we have to come to a point where we have to decide as a culture what we're going to consume and what we're going to produce, because what we consume informs what we produce. A better question to ask is not, what should my children be consuming? It's, what values do I want my children to absorb? What foundation do I want my children or my grandchildren or my nieces or my nephews? What foundation do I want to build for them? Because if you're feeding them stories that are empty, they're going to grow up empty. And if they grow up empty, they're going to be filled by the stories the world is telling them. The morals of the world are being put in place of these stories that we used to have, these stories that used to have value, that used to have merit and morals and truth embedded in them. We're losing it. They're not being told anymore. And I don't mean moral in a preachy sense. I mean moral in a foundational sense. We have to live on morals. We have to have morals, because if we don't, then our society has nothing to stand on. The most important thing when it comes to stories is substance, is truth, is life. Things that you can carry with you, that you can look at and say, yeah, I feel that. I feel that in a very real way. And we need to get back to that. If not as a culture producing, then as a culture consuming. And as we reconsume the stories that have those foundational realities, that those foundational truths and morals and virtues and values, as we reconsume those, new stories that are full of truth and value and moral and virtue will come from the children who grow up to be creators.